So as Pooja mentioned, I'm Tina Jadav, and this is
Rae Whittow-Williams.
So today's masterclass is really focused around public sector procurement from a client's perspective. So how does it work? And most importantly for you guys, how do you win work through our processes? So I'm going to kick things off with some really important context background. So you'll have to bear with me, but I'll try to make it as engaging as possible. So really there are four areas that we're going to cover today. So we're hopefully going to unpack public sector procurement and provide a bit of context to why and how we run our processes, what are the priorities, and how we're implementing new ideas around social value. Secondly, public sector procurement routes. So how do we decide which procurement process will run for which commission, and what advice can we offer those wanting to work with public clients? Next, winning work, and what does good look like from a client's perspective? And then lastly, overcoming barriers. So how do small organisations and new and emerging practices work with the public sector? So just to kind of give Rae and I a bit of a kind of understanding to who's in the room, can we have a show of hands for who's participated in a public sector procurement process? What do you think?
Yeah, 40%.
Half, okay. It's not going to get too many rotten tomatoes thrown at us, hopefully. So, and keep your hands up, actually, if you've been successful in winning work. Okay. Okay. Right. So, speaking generally, all public sector organisations must adhere to the value for money policy requirements. So Archika from Westminster earlier made a really important point around value for money. And it's important to stress that value for money is defined as providing the best mix of quality and effectiveness of the services bought. So it's not about cheapest bid wins. This should be achieved through competition unless there are compelling reasons not to. As I'm sure you all know, and Pooja alluded to this earlier, all public sector procurement is guided through EU procurement directives. So this essentially frames and guides the way in which we work. In line with the Mayor's policies and statutory obligations, we have a duty to follow a transparent, fair and value for money process. So, firstly, public money and priorities. The new draft London Plan represents step change in our approach and serves as a blueprint for the future development, sustainable, inclusive growth of our city. The concept of good growth underpins the plan and ensures that it is focused on sustainable development, putting an emphasis on quality of what's being delivered in the built environment. The Mayor and the GLA operates in an open and transparent spirit because essentially we are held to account by all Londoners. The GLA Group spends around 11 billion on its procurement activities every year. The scale and diversity of our procurement processes presents considerable opportunities for effective partnership working to achieve value for money and encourage innovative approaches. So, responsible procurement. On the 3rd of July 2017, the Mayor published a strengthened responsible procurement policy, which reflects his determination to establish fair employment practices with the GLA's group suppliers. The policy means suppliers who want to work with organisations across the GLA group will be encouraged to support other mayoral objectives, including helping London become a more resource-efficient and resilient city, as well as working with Londoners to bring around positive change to their communities. So the policy will be achieved by all the kind of bullet points that you see on the slide here. I really recommend everyone has a look at the responsible procurement policy. A lot of it's quite dry, but I think that the kind of summary and the kind of nuts of what it's saying really kind of applies to your everyday practice. So, public sector equality duty. So the public sector equality duty was developed in order to harmonise the equalities duties and to extend it across the protected characteristics. In summary, those subject to the equality duty must, in the exercise of their functions, have due regard to need to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment, victimisation and other conduct prohibited by the Act, advance equality of opportunity between people who share a protected characteristics and those that do not, and foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristics. social value. So the other obligation we have, the Public Services Social Value Act 2012 requires public bodies to consider how the services they commission and procure might improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of the area. So this isn't just about general kind of social good and good practice. It's about proactive and vigorous approach to inclusion and diversity that delivers immediate, tangible benefits to projects. So the Mayor's procurement objectives, commitments, I should say. So essentially you'll find this within the responsible procurement policy, but to kind of summarise, there are kind of 6 points that the Mayor has committed to doing. So the first one being enhancing social value, encouraging equality and diversity, embedding fair employment practices, enabling skills training and employment opportunities, promoting ethical sourcing practices and improving environmental sustainability. So time for hands up again. So how many of you have applied to be on a framework? Yeah. And secondly, how many of you are working with public sector clients outside of a framework? Yeah, not as many. So, public procurement routes. So, the Mayor's investment in London's built environment requires intelligent commissioning. This is an essential means of ensuring good growth and excellent design quality, whilst also maximising long-term value for money and widening participation in public projects. Generally, the way in which we operate tends to be relevant to the budget we have available. So the routes we use include the use of frameworks such as the Architecture, Design, Urbanism panel, invited lists, direct appointments, or through an ADUP process. So this rather scary looking diagram that looks like it was made on a very old computer attempts to break down the different ways we procure and work and how we essentially decide what's the kind of best route. So there's a whole kind of preparation stage. So essentially that's where we decide what the project scope is, what the budget is. We then go through an approval system. So this is where we approve the budget within the GLA. So that goes through a whole round of approvals from AD to finance to our legal teams. And it's once we have an approval, we then start engaging with TfL procurement. We then further work on the detail of our brief, which will then establish what the budget is, the timescales and the scope of the commission. Essentially, then we get to the kind of budget area. So if our commission is under £10,000, we can do a direct award. If it's between £10,000 and £50,000, we can go to an invited list or use a framework. Between £50,000 and £150,000, we can do a much broader invited list, use a framework, or if it's over £150,000, for us it's through a kind of ODU process. We then move through the whole kind of tender process, which includes kind of populating the kind of full specification, advertising it, running it through the e-portal, clarification, assessment, interviews, appointment, feedback, contract, all of those things. So kind of in a nutshell, that can take anything from 8 weeks to 4 months and typically requires input from about 8 to up to 20 officers. So, and Ray's going to now tell you a bit more about the framework.
So, building on the previous success of the Architecture, Design and Urbanism panel, the Greater London Authority and Transport for London established a new multidisciplinary framework in spring this year. Essentially, ADUP is a pre-approved framework of consultants who can be appointed to provide design services for public sector clients. It's jointly supported by the Mayor and TfL and provides the Greater London Authority family with a single design framework panel. It's been set up to help London's public sector deliver the very highest quality of architecture, public realm, urban regeneration and sustainable development. in the capital, and to support the principles of sustainability and good growth. So that's development that is socially, environmentally, and economically inclusive. To give you a bit of a background of the work that went through the previous version of the panel, we've got a few slides here of previous projects. Usage of that previous framework was really considerable, facilitating routine access to high-quality design services for many authorities. The previous panel saw over 100 projects procured, with over £30 million paid in fees and 27 public sector organisations accessing it. So here we have a new civic quarter for Harrow Council in Wilson Town Centre. Elsewhere in Harrow, the Byron Quarter project, including a new leisure centre. In Enfield and Newham, the panel was used to procure architects for housing projects. TfL used the framework to procure a cycling strategy for the 195-hectare Nine Elms opportunity area. Over in Hackney Wick, the LLDC used the ADUP framework to procure architectural services for Hackney Wick Station. And finally, in Tottenham Hale, the framework facilitated the design development of the North Tottenham Master Plan, which includes Tottenham Hale and the Tottenham Hale Station and the OSD. It's just another view there of the inside. So the ADUP framework forms part of the Mayor's Good Growth by Design programme, a call to everyone engaged in London's booming architectural design and built environment profession to help realise the Mayor's vision to create an inclusive built environment for all Londoners. Good Growth by Design sets out an integrated programme of work that seeks to enhance the design of buildings and neighbourhoods for all Londoners, recognising that good architecture and planning can make a real difference in the quality of the built environment. Procurement and commissioning are a core focus of the programme, recognising the importance of selecting the best design talent in delivering quality projects. You can see there that commissioning quality is actually pillar 5. So to give you a bit of just an overview of how that ADUP framework was procured, it was originally advertised through OJU, allowing talent from European companies the opportunity to tender and be part of the new panel. There was a rigorous 2-stage tender process, which was highly competitive, with over 1,100 submissions received in the first qualifying stage. It's worth noting that the turnover threshold was deliberately set low to enable small practices of 2 to 3 people to apply to it. And then through that SQ standard selection evaluation stage, the number of submissions was reduced to 269, with a total of 33 evaluators, comprising representatives from the GLA, TfL, mayoral development corporations, London boroughs, and notable built environment organisations. The invitation to tender stage, the second stage of the process, was deliberately structured to allow practices to showcase design flair, innovation, and new ways of thinking and working. The evaluation process placed emphasis on quality, clarity of the practice's thought process, overall communication, demonstrating the added value that can be brought to realising social, economic, and environmental outcomes, and how innovative design solutions can encourage and trailblaze the ideas presented in a city for all Londoners, really around social inclusion and diversity. So the resulting framework consists of 92 practices that are split across 12 categories of work that you can see on the slide there. So from the public sector client's perspective, the panel offers time and money savings by using pre-qualified potential suppliers, reducing the fixed costs associated with competitive procurement processes, and has been designed to work with a variety of wide project types and scales, particularly as the 12 distinct categories make it really versatile. And while it was developed by the GLA and TfL, the framework can be used by over 85 different types of public sector authorities and organisations, some of which was shown there on the right-hand side. This saves time and money because all the procedural compliance work has been done up front. And it's also completely compliant with EU procurement regulations. Oh, I've done it again. Sorry. So, in line with the Mayor's priorities for good growth and social inclusion and diversity, the ADUP technical assessment criteria is weighted at 70% for quality, including an approach to achieving social value, 25% towards financial value for money, and a further 5% is awarded for the quality and project-specific nature of bidders' equality, diversity, and social inclusion plans. This is the same criteria that was used when the panel was procured, and all authorities wishing to use the panel need to embed this assessment criteria into their briefs and call-off contracts. So, winning work, what you're all here to learn a bit more about. Time for another hands up. How many of you have submitted an ITT response before? That's not as many as I was expecting. And keep your hands up if you were successful in winning work through the ITT. So it's like less than 10, okay. So what does a good bid look like from the client's perspective? It may sound a bit that we're dumbing things down here, but a lot of what we're about to run through may seem really straightforward. And you'd be really surprised at the number of bids we receive that don't actually respond to the requirements of the ITT. Therefore, we would strongly recommend that you read the ITT in detail and prepare your submission to respond directly to those requirements. It's worth noting that whilst all ITT briefs are different, the following tips should give an overview of what we look for when assessing bids. So in terms of methodology and approach to the brief, this is often given a high weighting in assessment criteria, so it's worth taking the time to establish a strong response. This is really about your proposed design methodology, how you're approaching the brief, how you understand it, and your design intent. So you really need to demonstrate a sound appreciation of the issues addressed in the specification and brief, that your project methodology is not only realistic, concise, and achievable, but that it also addresses each of the tasks set out in the specification. How you propose to achieve social value through the design process or your approach to the brief. And we also assess the clarity and focus of the tender, including effectiveness in articulating the detailed methods to be used. It goes without saying that a clear and focused submission will outperform one that is haphazard and disorganized. It sounds really simple, but it's often the case. So we therefore encourage you to really understand your audience. Who is your client? What are their priorities? We've run through some of our mayoral priorities as a client at the GLA, but really go to the effort of understanding who your client is. Demonstrate clarity in your response and approach. Don't fall into the trap of using archispeak. Using long words and complicated phrases often doesn't come across well and will also kind of often just alienate your client. Use plain English. Take time to really understand the site in its context. A good ITT response will be highly contextual and site-specific. And we also encourage bidders to demonstrate an approach to achieving social value within the project. So you should look out for this in briefs and specifications. We see this project approach for achieving social value being about approach to local engagement, participation and co-design, approach to designing for various needs of the project users, existing local communities, and future community needs, with specific regard to promoting physical, social, and economic accessibility. Approach to collaborating with groups with protected characteristics within the existing community who are historically underrepresented in the authorship of the shared local built environment. Opportunities for local outreach, apprenticeships and training, and subcontracting and supporting the local supply chain. I won't run through these in detail, but the top image is an example of a meaningful community engagement scheme that was run as part of the Tower Court project, which essentially aided the to build trust within the local community residents, break down tensions between existing groups, and actually went a long way to completely understanding their needs, redesigning flat layouts and housing layouts for their specific needs, and it won unanimous support. It was incredibly successful. So achieving social value can also be about having a social value program, mentoring, access to higher education, building futures and opportunity. And these next couple of slides are a couple of images from the Futures London workshop that was held in August as part of the development of the emerging London Housing Design Guidance. The workshop was coordinated by May Architects with the involvement of Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust in order to gather intel on what the future of housing means to young Londoners and how housing can improve quality of life from their perspective. May Architects are using the findings from this workshop to inform the development of the new housing design guidance. In terms of project experience for an ITT, the key thing here is to ensure that it's relevant. Again, read the requirements within the brief and be guided by what type of project you're bidding for and any interesting overlaps with projects you've worked on. You should demonstrate evidence of working on projects of a similar nature and include project examples. Use the scope, client type and budget as a starting point to identify which projects you should include in that. Demonstrate an appropriate range of skills for the project team and or the experience of staff allocated to the project at hand. And make sure this is articulated across the whole team if you're including other consultants as part of your bid. Often you're asked to include CVs with an ITT response, so think carefully how these are presented to highlight the relevant experience, highlighting design and research skills, capability and capacity as relevant. And if you're asked to assemble a team as part of your bid, again, look to the requirements of the brief. Are they asking for specific services in terms of M&E, structural, landscaping, cost? Can you satisfy this in-house? If not, you'll need to assemble your team. Make sure you clearly articulate the roles and responsibilities of the different members of your team and identify who will be the lead consultant for communication purposes. We also encourage you to support new talent, particularly locally to the project itself, in order to address issues with equality, diversity and inclusion. And we see this most effective from a practice-based approach. So to use the example of the 5% EDI score as part of the ADUP criteria, we assess this on the basis of the supplier and associated project team. And this requirement is really focused on trying to achieve meaningful change with regard to the problem of diversity with the architecture and built environment profession. We think this will hopefully lead to practices being more aware of their practice makeup, their employment culture, and improving their diversity and inclusion policies. So this could include things such as working with underrepresented-led practices, incubation, approach to sharing cultural capital with underrepresented groups, approach to working with schools and universities to promote EDI in the built environment sector, and we also really encourage innovative responses.
So we're running out of time, but just to kind of quickly run through a few other things that you may want to think about through the bidding process, but not necessarily as part of your tender. Just jumping into interviews, I mean, it's really important part of the whole tender process. Within the project specification, it will state whether interviews are required. It also states the kind of timescales, format, and who will be on the panel. In addition, ahead of your interview, the client should make available a set of clarifications. So these are essentially areas that they require further explanation of. So for the interview, again, this is, very kind of basic stuff, but really prepare for those clarifications. You don't need to do a kind of regurgitation of the bid. It's the clarifications that the client will want to kind of understand a bit more on. The other thing, I mean, as Ray sort of stated before, speak in clear and plain English. Don't overcomplicate answers. Don't come across as overly architectural or academic. And speak to the whole panel. That's really important. And come across engaged and excited. Next, contract award. So this is essentially the kind of terms and conditions of your contract. Often it's kind of sort of enclosed within the ITT. It's this, big, long document. It's really important that you read that contract and flag anything ahead of kind of getting to the appointment stage. It's really important that you engage with the client and the procurement team on that. And finally, the inception meeting, again, basics here, but this is essentially the kind of kick-off of your project, and you want to kind of start things on the right foot. So be prepared for that. Prepare an agenda working with your client and cover off the basics such as kind of key milestones, how you're going to share information, how you're going to work together, etc. So really quickly going to kind of run through a very quick example of a good bid. So this is taken from the ADUP SQ stage, and essentially, we asked for 3 relevant examples which responded to the following criteria. So response to site, demonstration of quality, innovation, approach to working with clients and stakeholders, and approach to delivery. And we also asked for a whole set of information around, key things about the project. I mean, the important thing to say here is that you want to kind of keep things punchy. So use headlines as part of our criteria to format your response. So you'll see here the kind of header at the top says response and approach. It's just really clear to us that they've responded to that criteria. Not to overload the page, so a combination of kind of text and some images. And then lastly, just kind of in kind of bullet point, just keeping these bullet points just very clearly just tell us the kind of key information about the project. So we're probably running out of time, aren't we? So we're going to flick to this one.
Yeah. So just to finish, we thought we would just chat through a few barriers to entry, and how overcoming those barriers is something that all practices will need to do at some point in their kind of practice life. We think registering for relevant procurement portals is quite a good place to start for public sector work. There are a number of e-tendering portals out there, and many public sector clients use different ones. The GLA group use ProContract, but do some research and find out what your local authority or organisation use. A word of warning would be to make sure that you filter your notifications, otherwise you'll end up with a whole load of notifications for plumbing and cleaning contracts and all sorts, because they really do use it to procure everything. So use the filters if you don't want to have thousands of emails. Don't be put off by types of project either. Just because you don't have the exact project experience to include within an ITT doesn't mean you haven't got any transferable experience that you can use. So really look at the budget, the scope, and the client type as starting points to think about how the work that you have got might relate to what's being asked for. Be aware of the fee thresholds. You're now all experts as we went through the fee thresholds that we have to work to at the GLA here and public sector clients. And going to the effort of understanding your clients' processes can really make it much easier to understand their perspective and priorities. Also, as previously mentioned, often a good way for emerging small practices to get experience with public sector clients is to be part of a bigger team. And we actually encourage ADUP suppliers to form multidisciplinary teams for their mini competition submissions, particularly through the EDI requirement, but also as a way of kind of really championing young talent and emerging practices. In terms of other opportunities, it's just worth to take a moment to acknowledge that public sector clients are often very busy and under-resourced. So meeting with new practices is not at the top of their priority list. You therefore really need to be proactive about the areas you want to work in and use your initiative. So what facilities does your local area need? Who are the community groups working in your area? We often see architects partnering with community groups for projects through the Mayor's Crowdfund London programme, for example. And often these projects need someone with some organisational know-how to help steer them in the right direction. And this often leads to larger commissions. We therefore also encourage you to raise your profile and expand your own practice network. We're not suggesting you get in touch with all 92 practices on our ADUP framework, but you could look at this list and think about who would be most complementary to work with, bearing in mind your own practice's approach.
Thank you very much. So, of course, Tina and Ray were talking about the GLA and a particular London framework, but a lot of these sort of tips are universal, and a lot of how kind of public sector procures is universal. So I guess you sort of touched on it in the end, but most of the questions we're getting from the audience is really the barriers that small practices face, either to get onto a framework or to win work. So especially around kind of project experience, you know, often practices have to show 3 examples of projects they've delivered. So could you perhaps unpack that a little bit, or maybe give a good example, just really focusing on that, on the kind of project experience, and proving that working with a small practice is not a sort of risk?
I think it's about, again, reading the requirements of the brief and really channeling into some key aspects within that you can show assurance in, really. I think I don't know about using a specific example, but even if you don't, we don't always look at, want to find a practice that has done the exact same project. So looking at aspects like the budget or It could be the type of client that you're working with in another area. It could be a community group that has interface with a public client even, and building on that aspect of your bid and making that really strong. I think that can help to put across that you're a safe pair of hands, if you like. Tina went through an example through the SQ stage of really making it really clear in your responses to ITTs what we're looking at. Often practices kind of bombard us with huge amounts of information and practice profile, which really they've just repeated and sent out to multiple different ITTs, and they haven't taken the time to make it specific. That's not something that, you know, being provided with a big bucket load of A4 to rifle through doesn't show us that you've kind of gone to the effort of understanding what we're requiring. So,
but to interrupt you there, I think, and that's another sort of question that's coming up, it's a bit of a double-edged sword for small practices, because actually bidding for work and doing these processes is incredibly time-consuming, and for a small practice that takes up a lot of time. So that sort of repetitive bid is one way that practices save time. So what advice do we have for small practices for how to do this in a kind of more time-efficient way, but still being specific?
I mean, I completely understand the kind of clunky
Do you bring the mic closer?
Completely understand the clunky processes of kind of going through kind of e-portal systems, and it can be tricky. I mean, one of the examples I was going to talk about, actually, I might flick it up on the slide. Sorry, I'm cheating
so cheeky.
now. Sorry, cheating now. I mean, this is a really great project. So this project's called ShedX, and it's a project which is led by Takashi Hayatsu and Reed Watts Architects, working with Kingston University. And what's been really great about this project is it's a very small-scale project. The total project value was £17,500, and it started as a kind of crowd-funded idea, and it was essentially a way of kind of getting local talent to emerging new practices, engage with the community's work, and has essentially led to building a case for a much bigger investment into the wider area of Tolworth. And so that was an amazing, it was a cheesy shot of the architects there, but it was a really, I guess, I mean, the important thing to say about that is that it enabled us, it almost gave us a bit of a kind of introduction to these new practices. It's kind of built a kind of long-term, I guess, relationship between that community group, the place, and essentially Kingston University. So that's a really great example. It's called ShedX, so you should all look it up.
Great, and I guess the last question is, why don't we have 100% quality when we're sort of scoring bids?
Well, I think value can be perceived in many different ways, and we have to remember that this is public money that we're spending. So it would be great if we could go for 100% quality, but there are aspects of the procurement process and our own accountability as public sector clients to prove that what we're doing is within a financial budget.
And I think it's quite innovative in a way how you've included the 5% equality, diversity and inclusion as well, because that's another question, is how do we promote sort of women-led practices or BAME practices?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. The previous version of the ADUP framework didn't have a mandatory assessment criteria. And by the end of its life, councils were using it in very different ways, kind of 60% quality, 40% cost. And this time we've been really clear about it being a mandatory assessment criteria, and we actually do monitoring on all the procurement that goes through the panel from outside the GLA group. Obviously inside the GLA group it's done by default anyway, but to make sure that that mandatory assessment criteria is being adhered to. And initially we did get a little bit of pushback by some councils, about this 5%, what it was and why it was being taken from the cost. Essentially, but once you start to explain the bigger picture that we're trying to get to here, addressing the diversity of the profession and practice makeups and that kind of thing, and how that can benefit the project, as well, it's a kind of win-win situation really for the clients, and it also feeds into the duties that they have anyway as public sector clients.
Great, and I think it just sort of feeds back to what Sadie was saying this morning, is that I guess we have a role as practitioners to prove what the value of design is. So yes, it's been sort of London focused in terms of, you know, even the 70-30, so 70-25-5, but actually it's kind of part of our profession's responsibility to be able to advocate for the value of design in our local authorities, to push this idea of the kind of quality cost ratio. So we're going to end on that and move straight to our procurement enactment. So give us 2 minutes to do a quick switch over and get other panel members on stage. Thank you.